Welcome to episode 4 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I am Emily Ireson, Townhouse Steward at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Institutionally, Burbage was really theatre royalty. He was therefore, I think, somebody who forced Shakespeare to do something new in the way that he wrote his plays once he had Burbage as not just a sharer, but come the building of the Globe, also really effectively his landlord.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
One of the most influential figures in William Shakespeare's life that helped Shakespeare's success really form and take off was his greatest actor, Richard Burbage. Richard Burbage is known for being the first Hamlet, the first Lear, and really helping Shakespeare's characters that we know and love him for take off. In this week's episode, I'll be asking Bart Van Es, professor in English at the University of Oxford, about Richard Burbage. You'll hear about what Richard Burbage looked like, why he was considered theatre royalty, and exactly what the collaboration was between Shakespeare and Burbage. We'll talk about Burbage's life, his death, as well as Burbage's role in the theatres that Shakespeare owned and performed at. Bart Van Es is an author, historian, and professor in English at the University of Oxford and a fellow of St. Catherine's College. He has previously written books on Edmund Spenser and has a special interest in the writing of history in the Renaissance. His book, Shakespeare in Company, is the only available account of the real lives and acting styles of members of Shakespeare's acting company. His book was praised by the New Criterion and Renaissance Quarterly for its detail, study, and research into the innovative business style and collaborative format of Shakespeare's acting troupe. His latest book, Shakespeare's Comedies, A Very Short Introduction, came out in 2016. Dr. Van Es joins us today to explore the life of Richard Burbage, Shakespeare's leading actor and the first man to play the roles of Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear. Hello, Bart Van Es. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life. We're glad to have you with us today.
Hi, Cassidy.
Tell us about your book and why you decided to write about Shakespeare's acting company.
Well, I suppose it all started as a lecture series I was doing at the University of Oxford, which was about relating Shakespeare to his contemporaries, people like Johnson, Middleton, Peele, and Fletcher. And at the beginning, I just started out with this kind of question of how like Shakespeare's contemporaries was he? So I was reading the plays alongside those of his contemporaries, and it really struck me that Shakespeare was quite a lot like his fellow playwrights before the year 1594, and then quite a lot like them again after 1608, when he started co-writing with Fletcher. But this middle period of his career fascinated me because it seemed to me that Shakespeare was writing in a really quite radically different style. He was making characters relate to each other, remember each other. There was a kind of greater depth and breadth of characterization. So that was really the puzzle that got me sort of started on this project. And the moment at which Shakespeare starts having this quality of what I'd end up calling relational drama coincides with him becoming a shareholder in an acting company in the newly formed Chamberlain's Men. So I started researching acting companies and what we could actually learn about Shakespeare's actors, the people he worked with. And 7 years later, I had a book.
Well, I suppose I should clarify, we are talking about your book, Shakespeare in Company, which is not your latest book, but it is a book in which you spend an entire chapter on Richard Burbage specifically. And I wonder if you can describe him for us. Do we know what he looked like or what his personality might have been like?
Well, we have a portrait which is now in the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, but as with a lot of early modern portraits, the authenticity of that is pretty heavily under dispute. So the only things we can really say about him come from the roles he played. So we know he was the first Hamlet, the first Othello, the first Henry V, and the first Lear. he was clearly a very glamorous and loved actor, so I think we can assume that he was an attractive figure. He also seems to have been a pretty impressive specimen. I mean, one of the first appearances he makes in the record books is fending off troublemakers at his father's playhouse, the theatre, and threatening them with a stick. So I guess, he could hold his own. He was an all-rounder, I guess you could say, mixed with aristocracy, but also very popular with the crowds.
So formidable sort of force in the theater. Do you think that played into why he was so crucial to Shakespeare's success on stage?
Yeah, I think there's really two things that make him such a transformative influence on Shakespeare. And the first of those things is institutional, and the second is about his skill as an actor. I mean, institutionally, Burbage was really theatre royalty. His father, James Burbage, had been the builder of the first permanent playhouse in London, the theatre, and had himself a pedigree as an actor, working with Leicester's men, traveling the country in the 1560s. That position as theatrical impresario only kind of grew under James Burbage's influence. So they gained the Blackfriars indoor playhouse that Richard's father built. They had connections at court. So Richard's elder brother, Cuthbert, was somebody who could give Burbage influence in legal cases, in finding theatrical patrons. So Burbage was somebody with money, with huge influence in the theatre industry, but he was also, I think, the greatest actor of his age by some measure. And you get this vast outpouring of appreciation for him at his death in 1619, this idea of somebody who could personate, who acted so truly to the life, particularly associated with tragedy. You get these really vibrant descriptions of him that continue well into the 17th century. People like Richard Flecknoe talking about somebody who kept his identity even in the tiring house. So he was therefore, I think, somebody who forced Shakespeare to do something new in the way that he wrote his plays once he had Burbage as not just a sharer, but come the building of the Globe, also really effectively his landlord.
So as this theater royalty, we can see that he's bringing a lot of political weight and obviously a lot of attention and power to the stage. But how did Richard Burbage and William Shakespeare become this legendary partnership in the first place? How did they meet and how did they decide to work together?
I think in a slightly unorthodox sense, I don't think that Shakespeare started out being an actor. I mean, that's often sort of said in Shakespeare biographies that Shakespeare was an actor before he was ever a writer. I don't actually believe that. I think Shakespeare came to London in the very late 1580s, maybe early 1590s, as an aspirant intellectual. And we certainly see him announcing his presence as an important intellectual when he publishes The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis in those early 1590s. I think what happened is that Shakespeare, like most great poets of his age, also wrote for the theatre, and you see him writing probably collaboratively in early works like Henry VI and Titus Andronicus. And that was the kind of world in which you would then get to know actors. Lots of writers got to know actors. Ben Jonson's a comparable person. But the remarkable thing that Shakespeare did is he, in 1594, actually decided not just to do a bit of acting, which a lot of his contemporary playwrights did, but he actually decided to buy a share in a new acting company, which no writer had done before. And that company, the Chamberlain's Men, with its 8 sharers, effectively tied Richard Burbage and William Shakespeare together in a partnership that would last for the whole of Shakespeare's life and really for the important part of Burbage's career too. So it's that moment in 1594 when the new acting company, with one part of a kind of monopoly of court performance, is formed, that Shakespeare and Burbage become one, really.
And it's Burbage, isn't it, that was responsible for the theater we now call, we call it Shakespeare's Globe, but this was Burbage's doing, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. So, the great story of Daring Do on the kind of Christmas of 1599 to 1600 is that there were problems with the land on which the original playhouse, the theatre, had been built. The land was owned by somebody called Giles Allen, and who had allowed Richard Burbage's father, James Burbage, to build this great playhouse there, the theatre, but he wasn't really letting them extend the lease. So probably under a lot of pressure, Richard Burbage and his brother Cuthbert decided that they would physically move that playhouse, the old theatre, across the river to the south bank to an area where they had taken a very long-term lease on a piece of real estate. And the amazing choice that the two Burbage brothers made is they decided to invite a number of the sharers of the Chamberlain's men into that partnership. And Shakespeare took up a 1/10 share of the shares in the Globe, this new theatre. But yet, Richard and his brother Cuthbert were the real owners of the playhouse. They had 25% of the shares each, and it was really Burbage who was the star figure of that new place. So I think Shakespeare, as a writer, was massively lucky to have had a figure like Burbage who seemed to care about writers and care about some kind of collectivity. So that put Shakespeare, I think, in a very different kind of position from any other playwrights of the time, who often were kind of living on a breadline and found it very difficult to control their plays once they were written.
So you mentioned this unique collaboration of investors and the shareholders that they had going. Was this a truly innovative idea on Shakespeare's part, or was this method kind of a growing trend in the theater industry during the 17th century?
Well, it's a bit of both. I mean, I think it is a major innovation. So previous to the construction of the Globe, you'd never had an acting company effectively be its own housekeepers, as it was called, that an acting company would own effectively the theatre where they were performing. Previous to that, acting companies had really always just resided at playhouses, and that's what you see happening in Henslow's playhouses like the Rose. So it was a very innovative step. I think you do see kind of other attempts at that kind of arrangement starting in the 17th century. So, Thomas Hayward makes a similar kind of attempt to become a shareholder in Worcester's Men. But really, I do think that Shakespeare's position was exceptional. And that's, again, one of the reasons why he was wealthier than anybody else. And it's also thanks to that partnership that we have the folio at all. It's the surviving actors of the original Chamberlain's Men, of course, who give us the first folio in 1623.
Shifting gears just a bit, I want to mention Edward Allen, who is often called Marlowe's Burbage, and there are lines in several plays attributed to Burbage that were singled out as verbal assaults toward Edward Allen intentionally. So I want to ask you about their rivalry as actors. Were they competing with each other, or is this something we've applied to them historically?
Yeah, I think assaults may be a little too harsh a way of putting it. I think there was a really fascinating competition that went on between Allen and Burbage. Allen was clearly really the leading tragic actor of the late 1580s and early 1590s. And we remember him today in all those kind of great roles of the Marlowe canon. Allen was the first Faustus, Allen was the first Tamburlaine, the first Edward II. And he seems to have had this kind of grand declarative style. He was a very imposing presence. So Burbage, as the younger man, was coming in as somebody who had to define himself against that tradition. And I think from pretty early on, you see Shakespeare writing roles for Burbage that are about connecting with and contrasting to those big Allen roles. So, you have Shakespeare's Shylock versus Marlowe's Jew of Malta. You have Shakespeare's Henry V versus Tamburlaine. You have kind of Shakespeare's weak king, Richard II, versus Allen's Edward II. So there is rivalry there. But I think the play where we see that played out most fascinatingly is in Hamlet, where Edward Allen had actually returned to the stage after a period of retirement to launch a new playhouse, The Fortune, just at the moment when Shakespeare and Burbage and their fellows had built the Globe. And this was a moment of real overcrowding in the theatrical marketplace, a set of children's companies that also established themselves. And I think that in Hamlet, you see a very interesting way in which Burbage playing Hamlet is setting himself off quite markedly from the roles that Alain was reviving at his new theatre, The Fortune. And I think something like that moment where the player performs the rugged Pyrrhus speech in Hamlet is a kind of parody of Alain's style, and the way in which you see Burbage as Hamlet offering something, within the passer's show, as he puts it in his first great oration, is a way of kind of saying, I'm doing a better form of acting than you. Those critiques of the whirling hands, of the excessive player that Hamlet offers in his instructions to the players, they do seem to me like a implicit critique of this grand style that is now looking pretty dated and that was very much associated with Edward Alain.
So when he's not, competing with fellow actors or revolutionizing theater, what was Richard Burbage like personally? Did he ever get married or have children?
Yes, he had a wife, Winifred, and sadly, 7 of their 8 children died very young. I think one very touching detail is that in the year that Shakespeare dies, in 1616, Richard names the son who is born in that year William. And that seems to be one of those moments where you can see this strong personal connection that must have been between them. Richard Burbage is also one of only 3 London acquaintances who are mentioned in Shakespeare's will. But yeah, Burbage was, he was a big player. We get nice little details about his lifestyle as a result of a burglary at the house that he had in London, where we get this kind of list of properties that were stolen. And you see, he's a very well-to-do man. He and his brother were clearly very close. They were direct neighbours. And later they would also have a kind of country house together. So Burbage was somebody, again, I think one of the things that was very impressive about him is that he could operate in this cutthroat, but also at times quite collaborative business world of London. You see him lending money to people, meeting with members of the kind of mercantile class around London. He does a lot of things for the city as a citizen. So he is hugely active on all sorts of fronts, as a businessman, as an actor, and I think also probably as a sort of social mover and shaker.
Some historians even tell of him being a prolific painter and possibly throwing his name in the ring as an artist for the Chandos portrait. Now, as you mentioned, a lot of the portraits of this time period are hotly contested, including that one. What do you think? Could he have painted the Chandos portrait?
Yeah, I'm always very cautious with these kind of things. The one absolute sure likeness of Shakespeare we have is the woodcut on the first folio. And anything else you are having to kind of argue about a provenance of a portrait, a reputation that it had, usually much later in the 17th century. It's definitely true that Burbage was a painter. He's remembered by John Webster as a painter. And there are kind of nice little details, like at one point he's employed to paint an impressa for the Earl of Rutland, which Shakespeare writes. It's a wonderful little tiny vignette of that world that Shakespeare must have had, of how you connect with the aristocratic patrons of a playing company. But really, we know far too little about what kind of painting Burbage did. I mean, it's possible that he only painted impressa rather than actual kind of portraits. These stories end up developing around Burbage later, but there's no contemporary reference to him as a painter, so or not as a painter of portraits. So I'd love it to be true, but I have to say that I can't really vouch for that being the case.
So you mentioned his funeral earlier, but how did he die and how old was he?
So he was pretty much the same age as Shakespeare, or Shakespeare just turning 51. He was 52 when he died in 1619 and was still acting at that time. I mean, this kind of fantastically kind of driven person you get from that. It's interesting that Henry Condell, who seems to have been his main kind of sparring partner in Shakespeare's plays, stopped acting once Burbage did. So yeah, he died in 1619, apparently rather suddenly. And as a result of the fact that he was still a very active presence on the London stage, there was this very significant outpouring of elegies, of complaints. Lots of contemporary playwrights made mention of the loss of Burbage, people like kind of Thomas Middleton, for example, talking about an eclipse of playing. an important patron of Shakespeare's company, also talks about the Earl of Pembroke, the third Earl of Pembroke, talks about not wanting to see plays, how he can't bear to see a play after the death of Richard Burbage, who he refers to as a kind of, real close acquaintance. And this is a major aristocrat. The death was a genuine national event, and Burbage was just fantastically famous. I mean, he's a person who appears as a character, for example, in a set of university plays, the Parnassus plays at Cambridge, as somebody fantastically famous. Somebody who appears also in the inductions of various contemporary plays as somebody that people went to the theatre to see.
Well, obviously, from what you've shared with us, he was not just, famous, but as you say, so beloved. And I wonder if you can reconcile these two ideas for me, because when you read about 17th century theater, you're often told that these careers were disreputable, that it was the low part of society and the tossed aside people. But then at the same time, you have Burbage as this example of someone whose death was mourned at the highest levels of a country. How is it possible that players could be considered so expendable and at the same time be this beloved?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was an enormous spectrum that fell under that title of player. So, Bentley talks about there probably being around 1,000 players in England at the time of Shakespeare. And most of those are very small playing companies traveling as almost kind of peddlers with fardels on their backs, with kind of impromptu performances often. And so they were, often seen as this rather kind of marginal group within society. What Shakespeare's company was, I think, is just very radically different from that kind of troupe. And I think in some ways that has been quite distorting in how people have looked at Shakespeare in performance now. Even I'm a bit critical of things like the Royal Shakespeare Company's model of touring Shakespeare, where they kind of come on sometimes kind of banging their drums as if they are sort of town criers. Shakespeare's company was, effectively a royal institution. I mean, they become the King's Men in 1608. They are given money by King James during times of plague to sustain them. They are servants of the royal household, and they're producing elite entertainment, particularly for Christmas. We know that James sometimes asked for plays to be repeated and so on. So I don't think that the chamberlains or King's Men were really ever considered anything less than a very important cultural force. So, yeah, there was always a degree of kind of cultural cringe when it came to putting yourself on a stage. It's not something that an aristocrat would have done at this time. But, that also kind of counts for writing plays. Aristocrats would have been embarrassed to write public plays for the stage. So I don't think we should really think about players as some kind of lower order of society at all, really.
Impressive. Richard Burbage's legacy is truly impressive, certainly a powerful figure of theater in Shakespeare's time. Well, I do have some questions not directly related to Shakespeare, but before I jump into those, is there anything else from the life of Richard Burbage that you would want to make sure we know?
Well, I think it's good to also know about the way that Burbage was important to other actors in this period and other playwrights. So I think it's nice to know that, Jonson refers to him as the greatest player in Bartholomew Fair, that Jonson wrote specifically for him a character like Volpone, or that Middleton wrote for him too. So, we shouldn't just think of this being a Shakespeare collaboration. And in very interesting ways, if you place Shakespeare within the sort of theatrical world of his age, then thinking about Shakespeare's reputation, you're kind of often also thinking about Burbage's reputation. So a character like Vindici in The Revenger's Tragedy is a kind of spoof of Hamlet, but would also have been played by Burbage. So that kind of continuity of Burbage across writers in this period, I think, can give you a kind of richer sense of influence. So I suppose that's one thing I'd sort of highlight about Burbage, yeah.
Thank you. Well, think about the books you've read the last couple of years. What would you say are the one or two titles that immediately come to mind as having had the greatest impact on you?
Yeah, well, for Shakespeare and Company, I think that the two most important books for me were Tiffany Stern's Rehearsal from Shakespeare to Sheridan. I think Tiffany's really kind of quietly revolutionizing theatre history in the way that she looks at manuscripts, at the way that she learns from Restoration theatre and applies those lessons to earlier theatre. Just a kind of respect and fascination that she had for the process of theatrical production. That's something I learned from a huge amount, and I always look forward to everything that she does. So her Documents of Performance has come out fairly recently, I think another remarkable book. The other person I think I would highlight as a real influence is James Shapiro. I had already started on this book when 1599 came out. So in some ways I was kind of going, there are a few points that he came up with that I kind of thought, I'd found those too. But before that, also his book Rival Playwrights had a massive influence on me. And I've been similarly excited by 1608. So I think Tiffany and James in very different ways are allowing us to kind of visualize that material world of the theatre that Shakespeare operated in, taking him seriously as an intellectual at the same time as thinking in a very exact way about the circumstances for each individual production, no longer having this kind of excluded Shakespeare who just sort of operates in Shakespeare studies, but instead seeing him as, a genuinely very special person, but also a continual collaborator and friend of his contemporaries.
So, what is next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I've got something completely non-Shakespearean that I've got coming out in July, which is a book called The Cutout Girl, which is the life of a Jewish girl in hiding in the Netherlands during World War II. So that's a kind of novel combined with a kind of archival research trip by me, so that the girl is now an 85-year-old, and I conducted a series of interviews with her. So I'm quite excited to see how that book is received. On the kind of early modern front, I'm working a lot on children's companies. So these acting companies that were the rivals to Shakespeare's troupe in the 1600s. I think there's a lot still to be found out about those. And I'm also beginning a book on Robert Armin, who really is, I think, the other clearly identifiable actor who had a lot of influence on Shakespeare. So where Burbage was the great tragic actor, Armin, the jester figure, the first touchstone, the feste, and the first fool in Lear. I'm very interested in him. He wrote a lot as well, his own plays, his own collections of poetry, his own translations. So I think getting us more of the world of a Shakespeare contemporary like Armin is a great way of kind of understanding him more. So yeah, a book on Armin will come out in due course.
Exciting stuff. Well, Bart Van Es, Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford, I have really appreciated you sharing your time with us today and for giving us this inside look at the life of Richard Burbage. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much, Cassidy.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.